Hello, and welcome to Medieval Mondays with Reilly Nolan voiceovers. Anyone who's ever been in a relationship of any kind will tell you that things aren't always sunshine and rainbows. Even the best couples will have days when everything is just wrong. There are times when you just want to hash things out in maybe not the healthiest and definitely not the most wholesome of ways. Now, when I stumbled across the subject of today's episode, I couldn't decide if I felt like it was going to be the best idea I'd ever heard or the worst. So, my dear medieval history children, we need to talk about divorce by combat. To get started, we need to get acquainted with the medieval concept of divorce, or maybe the lack thereof. In the medieval period, the church allowed couples to divorce in a very limited number of circumstances. Things like adultery, the use of coercion to wed, and marriages that were carried out in secret were some. Sorry, Romeo and Juliet, but your marriage wouldn't have flown in the medieval period. Other reasons were tied more closely to the ability for a person to consent to the marriage, either legally if they were already promised to another person, or if they were below the age of majority and were simply too young to actually give their consent. For a boy, it was 14, and for a girl, it was 12. A divorce could also be requested if a marriage happened between two individuals who were actually related. But that's not just biologically related. The reason would extend to spiritual relations. For example, a godparent could not be wed to a godchild. If any of these criteria were fulfilled, then a person could ask for a divorce, but there was no guarantee that the church would actually grant it. Okay, let's assume the church actually allowed a divorce. What would the legal proceedings look like? I am so glad you asked. Dear future husband, my favorite method of divorce was actually discovered in a medieval Germanic manuscript found by Professor Kenneth Hodges from the University of Oklahoma. And the manuscript was essentially a rule book for how duels ought to be fought, and it had its own section outlining legally sanctioned duels. Yeah. If a husband and wife decided to carry out their separation through divorce by combat, then it would look something like this. In order to curate a fair fight, certain rules had to be established. Since men in the medieval period were better acquainted than the women with fighting and battle tactics, as well as being larger and stronger, they were saddled with handicaps for the battle. The man would be placed in a waist-height hole about 1 meter wide, and then have one hand tied behind his back. The woman, considered to be at a disadvantage without that, was allowed to roam freely and use both of her hands. Both parties were provided with weapons, the husband with 3 clubs and the wife with 3 makeshift clubs or flails that were created from a rock being wrapped in a length of cloth. In order to keep a fair fight, both the clubs and the rock flail were approximately the same length. Now, I'm sure most couples just went about beating each other with their clubs and rock flails, but how did they decide the victor? And what exactly were they deciding? Divorce by combat was used to determine who was telling the truth in a situation where there were no witnesses and no evidence to determine the facts. So they got to duke it out to prove their innocence, just without any proof. The loser of the fight almost always wound up dead. To be defeated at the time, an individual would either have to be killed during the scuffle with their soon-to-be ex-partner, they would have to have lost all 3 of their weapons and be defeated, or, and this is where that pit comes back into play, the man would have to either be pulled from his hole or drag his wife into it. Regardless of how they were beaten, they were then taken by the authorities and put to death. The winner would get their freedom, but it really did end up being till death do us part. I have been Reilly Nolan, and thank you for listening to this week's episode of Medieval Mondays.